Now, Jones isn't trying to argue that God is, in fact, a white racist. He has his own solution to the problem of evil and to the questions of theodicy, which involve a more humanistic approach within the field of Black theology and the study of religion more generally. But for our purposes and thinking about the problem of evil and how we might shift or change the way that we approach the problem of evil, I think there are a couple of things that we can take away. One of the things that we can take away is that the examples of suffering and evil we use matter. They matter in terms of what kind of problem the problem of evil is. If we focus primarily on specific historical examples that are kind of events, they are things we can pinpoint in time, that shapes our response to the problem of evil in certain ways. If we take into account things like ethnic suffering, we shift the kind of problem that we are trying to solve when we think about the problem of evil. There's a term used by Rob Nixon that I really like, and that's slow violence. It's violence that isn't dramatic always. It's something which unfolds over generations, and I think racism often works that way. Certainly, there are very dramatic examples of racism and racist violence and discrimination, but there's also a kind of longer-lasting, insidious racism that is more ambiguous and harder to identify sometimes. And that kind of racism, I think, presents a challenge to thinking about the problem of evil. And it's a challenge that goes unnoticed if we're not attuned to this kind of ethnic suffering that Jones identifies. The examples of evil and suffering that we use also matters in terms of whose suffering is visible to us. We spend a lot of time in the UK education system thinking about the Holocaust. We talk about the horrors of that event. We learn about it in history, and we talk about it in philosophy of religion. It comes up in studying the problem of evil. It's a form of evil and suffering which is present to us. It informs our political and philosophical imagination. And I don't think the same thing is true of slavery and anti-Black racism. Those are topics that are sometimes addressed, but not as much as they should be. And by considering them as examples within studying the problem of evil, we help to make that form of evil and suffering more visible to us so that it too can inform the way we think about the world. And finally, whether you are studying religious studies or philosophy and ethics, I think if you have addressed slavery or anti-Black racism in the course of your studies, it's probably in terms of a kind of ethical issue. So we talk about slavery historically in terms of how terrible it was, some of the motivating factors in the slave trade, how it impacted the development of the United States, how people benefited from the slave trade, things like that. And then when we talk about racism, we talk about it as an ethical issue. And the key takeaway there is we shouldn't be racist, that racism is bad. And we might talk a little bit about the different varieties of racism or how racism has changed over time. But it's primarily seen as an ethical issue. And I think thinking about racism and slavery in terms of the problem of evil starts to show ways that racism isn't just an ethical issue. It's something which we should be thinking about in terms of political philosophy. We should think about in terms of epistemology and in terms of religion. Racism remains a pervasive feature of our social life. It is an enormous issue in the United States, in the UK, around Europe, and all over the world. And we should think about it and all of its complexity. And philosophy of religion is just one way that we can start that task.